Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a field that, honestly, often looks more like abstract art than hard science. We're talking about the microstructure of steel.
Right.
And we want to move beyond just, appreciating the aesthetic beauty of a micrograph. Our mission today is to understand the secret history that's captured inside that metal, to really interpret what the shapes are telling us about the atomic decisions made during cooling.
Exactly. And, microstructure analysis can feel, well, it can feel overwhelming. There are so many potential phases: ferrite, pearlite, bainite, martensite. But we have a shortcut for you. We're going to filter all that complexity through just two fundamental atomic mechanisms. These are what drive the transformation from high-temperature austenite.
So if you understand these two paths, you're saying you can pretty much predict the properties of any steel.
That's the idea, yes.
Okay, so that's our focus. The two paths out of austenite, which has that face-centered cubic or FCC structure. And the phases that result are things like ferrite, the alpha phase, BCC, and the intermetallic cementite.
Theta, right.
And their mixtures like pearlite. But then you get into the stuff created when you cooled too fast.
The non-equilibrium phases.
Right. Martensite, bainite, and that interesting hybrid, Widmanstätten ferrite.
And to map all of this, you really just need two diagrams. First is the iron-carbon equilibrium diagram that just governs the basic composition. Is it a hypotectoid steel or a hypereutectoid steel? Less carbon or more carbon than that sweet spot.
And the second one is the big one for today.
The time-temperature transformation diagram. The TTT diagram. This is the key to our deep dive because it shows what happens when we introduce speed, time, cooling rates.
Yeah.
And that brings in all those non-equilibrium structures that really define modern steel performance.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the entire universe of steel microstructure, it boils down to only two main ways atoms can rearrange when they jump out of austenite. And this distinction, the atomic mechanism, it tells us everything.
It tells us everything. The final shape, the chemistry, and critically, the mechanical properties.
Yeah.
Let's dive into the first one. We call it the reconstructive mechanism. Think of this as the civilian path.
The civilian path, the relaxed, patient path.
Precisely. This mechanism requires physically breaking and then reforming atomic bonds, so it involves a lot of diffusion.
Meaning the atoms have to actually move around.
They have to be mobile enough to diffuse over distances, comparable to the size of the product that's growing. And because they're diffusing freely, this is the path that avoids high-strain energy. But, and this is a big but, it naturally leads to chemical partitioning.
So elements moving to where they'd rather be.
Exactly. Carbon or other alloying elements will migrate. That means the product phase has a different composition than the phase you started with. In this scenario, any atomic correspondence between the parent and the product is it's completely lost.
Okay, so if you see evidence of elements clustering or separating, you know you're on the civilian path. Now, what's the flip side? The displacive mechanism, the military path.
This is the disciplined approach. Instead of breaking bonds and allowing diffusion, the crystal structure changes through a homogeneous deformation of the parent lattice.
A deformation.
Yeah, imagine forcing the FCC structure into the BCC structure by sort of squeezing and shearing it, all while keeping the relative order of the atoms. It's entirely diffusionless.
Diffusionless, so everything happens almost instantaneously.
Instantly. No time for elements to wander off. There's zero change in chemical composition between the parent and the product. A one-to-one atomic correspondence is maintained. And that, by the way, is the basis for things like the shape memory effect.
But there has to be a trade-off.
Oh, massive one. Forcing atoms to move in this disciplined way generates huge internal strain energy. And to minimize this energy, the phase absolutely must adopt a very specific shape, the thin plate.
Ah.
And that's your first major visual rule. Plate shapes scream displacement and high strain.
So the key visual takeaway is that simple. Plates mean high strain, no diffusion, and blobby, more complex shapes mean low strain and lots of diffusion.
That's the fundamental differentiator. It's a phenomenal conceptual shortcut.
Okay, let's focus on the reconstructive phases first, where that mobility and diffusion are mandatory. We'll start with ferrite. We know diffusion allows for these complex shapes, so what stands out about the different morphologies of ferrite?
Well, the shape difference depends entirely on where the ferrite decides to nucleate. When ferrite forms at the austenite grain boundary, the gamma boundary, we call it allotriomorphic ferrite.
Allotriomorphic.
And because it's growing fast along that boundary, its shape is dictated by the boundary itself. It doesn't reflect its own internal crystal symmetry.
So its shape is just a shadow of its surroundings.
Precisely. Now, in contrast, you have idiomorphic ferrite. This nucleates within the grain, far from any boundary influence, so it's unrestrained, and it develops a perfectly crystallographically faceted shape, like a miniature cube.
And what's the big structural giveaway for all of these reconstructive products?
Because they are diffusion controlled and atoms are breaking bonds, phases like ferrite or pearlite can actually grow across austenite grain boundaries. They can thicken right into adjacent grains.
And that's a huge clue. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Pearlite. When you look at a micrograph, it looks deceptively simple, right? Like these alternating layers. But what is it in 3 dimensions?
Pearlite is a mixture of ferrite and cementite. It forms by cooperative growth, where both phases grow at the same time at a single front with the austenite. Now, your 2D cross-section looks like layers, but in 3D, the structure is actually an interpenetrating bicrystal.
And interpenetrating by crystal.
Yeah, the cabbage and water analogy is probably the best way to visualize it.
Wait. So slicing that is just a 2D optical illusion? The whole colony is one continuous grain.
Yes, the ferrite is a continuous phase, and the cementite is an interpenetrating continuous phase. This is vital, because while reducing the spacing between the lamellae makes the steel stronger, the colony size itself is the true crystallographic grain size.
And that affects toughness.
That dictates toughness, because a single cleavage crack can pass undeviated right across the entire colony. Low energy failure.
That structural reality is key. Speaking of shaping the structure, what about spheroidization? If pearlite is inherently layered, why does heating it cause those layers to ball up?
It's pure thermodynamics. Spheroidization is just driven by minimizing interfacial energy.
Right, a sphere has the minimum surface area for a given volume.
Exactly. So the heat treatment lets the cementite lamellae break up and spheroidize, and it greatly reduces the total ferrite-cementite interfacial area. It happens much more easily in fine pearlite. And you see this kind of element partitioning constantly in commercial alloys. Think about the problem of a banded microstructure in steels with manganese or mangan.
Which is most of them.
Most of them. During cooling, M segregates. It creates Mn-enriched and Mn-depleted bands. Ferrite prefers low alloy content, so it forms in the Mn-depleted regions, and the carbon gets pushed into the Mn-enriched bands, which then transform into these continuous bands of pearlite. And you get that distinct, structurally variable pattern.
Okay, now we shift gears entirely. We're stepping into the displacive transformations, where that mechanical strain is the core driver. We're talking thin plates. And martensite is the most famous product of this path.
Martensite is the classic diffusionless transformation. It's initiated instantly when austenite cools below the martensite's start temperature. The lattice change is described as an invariant plane strain. It involves both a huge shear, about 25%, and a slight dilatation.
It sounds violent, atomically speaking.
It is a violent restructuring. The resulting strain energy is so immense that martensite must form as a thin plate just to minimize that energy penalty. And that massive strain is why martensitic steels are so hard, but also so brittle.
And what's the crucial consequence of this disciplined, boundary-confined movement?
Martensite plates are absolutely confined to the grain of nucleation, the organized atomic movement required for the shape change. It simply can't be sustained across the original gamma grain boundary.
And this leads to a paradox for engineering strong steels, right?
The structural paradox, yes. Since the gamma boundaries aren't physically destroyed by the transformation, a structural vestige of the prior austenite grain boundary remains.
It's like a ghost boundary.
It is. And these boundaries are notorious sinks for detrimental impurities like phosphorus or sulfur. So that boundary becomes a weak spot. It becomes a preferential site for failure. This makes strong martensitic steels highly susceptible to impurity embrittlement. They can fail with minimal energy absorption. The structure preserves the weakness of its prior self.
That makes perfect sense. But if martensite is diffusionless, why does tempering require heat and time? Isn't that just reintroducing diffusion?
That's a great question. Tempering happens after the transformation is complete. The heat you apply, even low temperatures, say 190 degrees C, provides the mobility needed to relieve the strain. It forces the trapped carbon atoms out of that supersaturated lattice.
And they form precipitate.
They precipitate as fine cementite particles. And that lowers the energy and increases the toughness, all without destroying the overall hard structure.
Now let's look at bainite. Its morphology is still plates, so it must share that displacive core with martensite.
It does. Bainite shares the displacive atomic growth mechanism. That's why it also appears as plates. The key difference is the nucleation temperature. Bainite forms at temperatures where carbon can still diffuse a little.
So it's not totally diffusionless.
The transformation starts displacively, but then carbon partitions after the initial growth and precipitates as cementite. And this partitioning actually defines the two types. Upper bainite forms when carbon has enough mobility to get out of the ferrite and precipitate between the ferrite platelets. Lower bainite, though, forms at lower temperatures, so partitioning is slower.
So the carbon gets trapped.
Some of it does. It precipitates inside the ferrite platelets as well as between them.
We've covered the extremes, the civilian and the military paths. What about the hybrid, the transformation that's neither purely one nor the other? What's going on with Widmanstätten ferrite?
Widmanstätten ferrite is the classic mixed transformation. It grows via what we call perequilibrium. The big substitutional alloy atoms like manganese or nickel, they're too slow. They're stuck. They have to move together, disciplined, like the displacive path.
Okay.
But the small interstitial carbon atoms, they do diffuse and partition, just like the reconstructive path.
So it gets the high strain energy of displacement, but its speed is throttled by carbon diffusion.
Exactly. It forms those characteristic thin wedge-shaped plates because of that high strain. And to manage that strain energy, the phase often grows as two back-to-back self-accommodating plates at the same time.
And what does that do to the structure?
It relieves the strain locally, but it tends to result in a much coarser, less desirable microstructure overall.
So if we're in the lab and we see a sample with this confusing mix of phases, how do we use this framework to identify them quickly just with an optical microscope?
The first, most powerful tool is always the morphological rule, the one derived from the atomic mechanism.
Look at the boundaries.
Look at the boundaries. Martensite and bainite plates have straight, sharp edges, and they are strictly confined within the original austenite grains. If you see a phase, like a colony of pearlite, growing across or enveloping a prior austenite grain boundary, you know instantly it was a diffusion-controlled reconstructive process.
It's a dead giveaway.
It's the gold standard. Secondary visual cues help too. Bainite etches relatively dark because it's a dense mix of ferrite and cementite, lots of interfaces for the etch end to attack. Untempered martensite, which lacks these precipitates, often etches light. But that mechanism rule confined plate versus crossing equiaxed is your best friend.
And what if the transformation was so complete, say in a fully martensitic steel, that those prior austenite boundaries are completely obscured?
Then you rely on specialized techniques to reveal that hidden history.
Yeah.
Thermal grooving is the standard. You polish the sample and hold it at the austenitization temperature. Surface tension then naturally carves grooves along the prior austenite grain boundaries.
So you can see where they used to be.
And you can measure the original grain size, which, even in a displacive structure, remains critically important for performance. The final synthesis here is that the atomic choice. Did the atoms have time to chill out and diffuse, or were they forced to rearrange violently under strain? That choice is the entire difference between a tough, ductile steel and a brittle, high-strength one.
That's really the aha moment. The physical look of a phase, the plate or the blob, and its location relative to the boundaries is a direct readout of its history. It's like a geologist reading rock layers, only we're reading atomic history.
Precisely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into steel's inner life. We really encourage you to use this simple framework, displacive versus reconstructive, the next time you look at any microstructure. It is the key to shortcutting your understanding of material performance.
Yeah. And here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. Since both high-strength martensite and bainite are structurally similar, and both suffer from high-strain energy, and both are fundamentally susceptible to impurity embrittlement at those critical prior austenite grain boundaries, how might engineers design advanced alloys to harness the sheer speed of the displacive transformation while simultaneously mitigating the risk of impurity-induced failure at those confinement boundaries?